Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 3 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my webinar and podcast co-hosts, Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. So some of you will remember back in April, we did a show on decarbonizing transportation with Amy Myers-Jaffe of Tufts University. One part of the transportation system we didn't really talk about during that show was aviation. So today we fill in that gap. And like other parts of the system, when it comes to decarbonizing aviation, there's really no shortage of potential solutions, from biofuels to hydrogen to better aerodynamics. But those solutions aren't cheap and could make air travel a lot more expensive than it is today, something that the airlines and customers like us don't want. So how do we decarbonize aviation? Well, today we have a great guest to help us answer that question. Dr. Stephen Barrett is a professor and department head of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT, where his research focuses on helping aviation to get to net zero environmental impacts. Stephen is director of the MIT Laboratory for Aviation and the Environment and leads MIT's Electric Aircraft Initiative. He's originally from London. He did his undergrad and PhD at Cambridge University. And our Canadian listeners may recognize him for his appearances on CBC's Quirks and Quarks. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
So here's the format for the next hour. David, Sara, and I will talk news and not news to start. And then Stephen's going to help us with a primer on aviation decarbonization, after which the four of us will have a discussion until about 15 minutes past the next hour, wherever you are in your own time zone. And after that, we'll get to your questions. You can send in your questions via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Please don't use the raise hand function. Mika, as always, our day of webinar wonderful assistant. Thank you, Mika. He will screen for live questioners. We're recording, so if you don't want to be part of recorded history, just say no if Mika asks you to pose your question live. All right. Let's start things off with this week's Energy versus Climate news and not news segment. Sara, you've got a piece of news.
That's right. My piece of news is news that's not news, so it's news. And that is the story about real steel in the ground or in the water for an offshore wind farm in the UK. So this is the UK's Hornsea 2 offshore wind farm. It will be the largest in the world when it's completed. And it's just reached another couple of construction milestones. So basically, all of the foundations are in place. There's about a third of the turbines left to install, and the offshore substation is finished. And this is a 1.3 gigawatt wind farm. And it is, I think, news because it's really a big project that's moving forward without a lot of delays or, not actually happening when we talk about what could you do to grow renewable energy. And I think that there's also the potential for it to get even bigger because while this world's largest offshore wind farm at 1.3 gigawatts is going to be using about 8 megawatt turbines, the 14 megawatt new G model has just now been operating for the first time. So feels a little bit like the sky's the limit when it comes to offshore wind farm size, but I think it's starting also to get to a size that's really meaningful when we talk about some of these projects, especially with really large capacity factors upwards of 65%.
So really, it's news because it's the renewable electricity industry delivering on its potential after many years of promising to do so.
Yeah. And projects moving forward in a world where we sometimes like to talk about big projects, not happening.
Yeah. Steady increase in capacity factors and steady decrease in the cost of offshore, especially. And I think that, to me, is the bigger part of the news because offshore was very expensive and it's really coming closer to convergence.
Well, I'd love to see the CEO has the news conference saying, see, we told you so. Now wait for the next one. All right. Well, I've got a piece that's not news. And last Thursday, the Alberta government released the final report on its inquiry into sources of funding for climate and environmental activism work that really focused on Alberta's oil sands. And after spending $3.5 million of taxpayer money over 2 years, it came up with what I think is the epitome of not news, and that is the finding that a whole bunch of environmental NGOs got foundation funding from both sides of the border to run oil sands, climate, and pipeline campaigns, and they broke 0 laws by doing so. Now, I know that the commissioner of the inquiry, Steve Allen, knows it's not news because I told him exactly that over a coffee in the summer of 2019. And that coffee only cost the taxpayer all of $3, not $3.5 million. But on a more serious note, given some of the wildly divergent and differing coverage of the report in the media, and largely between left and right-wing media that I saw, and of course the usual Twitter rants, I'm worried that the report, and as silly and as wasteful an exercise as it was, it puts us further down the path of conflict between the right and the left on climate. And I think this is at a time when we need fewer divisions, not more. And I'm worried that this thing has just created more divisions. So bit of a tongue-in-cheek segment, not news given this finding, but it does still trouble me and I'm worried about it.
Same. I was really shocked by some of the comments coming out of Alberta cabinet that really, conceded nothing was illegal, but really wanted to say that it was just wrong for Albertans to be taking money to oppose the oil sands, and kind of saying with strength that this is purely a Alberta decision. And the answer is it's not purely an Alberta decision because we live on one planet with one atmosphere. It's just complete nonsense to say that. And it's reasonable to say Alberta has things it needs to protect and jobs to protect, but to just make a statement as bold as that this late in the game struck me as pretty troglodytic, which is not a word, but
yeah.
And I would contrast that with a really interesting new project out from Amy Westervelt called Rigged, which is a really well-researched website and archive on the history of corporate-funded disinformation. In this case, more focused on the US, but I can imagine that many of those things would apply in Canada as well, too. So quite a contrast between the findings there and the lack of findings in this case.
Yeah, it's interesting around that, the inquiry. And it's a story, let's be frank, it's been around for 10 years. When I talk to journalists, with the exception of talking to National Post journalists, which, by the way, a study, our own National Post, found that it has the most anti-climate bias coverage of any publication in the Anglosphere over the last 15 years. But when I talk to any journalist, they would say, point out the sheer hypocrisy to begin with. So transboundary international support for conservation issues is bad, but capital markets should have no boundaries, and therefore capital flowing in from all sorts of places to develop the oil sands is good. And I think we need to get away from that just complete false dichotomy of good versus bad.
Well said.
All right. Well, let's launch the poll and let's bring our guest, Stephen Barrett, into the conversation. So, Crystal, thank you. By 2030, total global emissions from aviation will be, you have choices, higher than they were in 2019. We are, by the way, using pre-COVID, sort of the last year of, let's say, stabilized aviation industry operations. Higher than they were in 2019, lower than they were, largely unchanged. So tell us what you think as you're doing. So Stephen's going to help us just understand some of the basics of aviation decarbonization. So Stephen, let's put things in perspective around the gravity of the challenge. So what kind of contribution does aviation make to annual global emissions? And then therefore, by extension, is it really an area that's important that we should be focusing on?
Yeah, and like many things in energy and climate, it's a matter of perspective and timescale. So if you took a sort of limited short-term perspective and said, well, I'm just looking at the emissions only of CO2 and only today, then the answer is something like 3% of global CO2. And from that, you'll conclude, well, probably not that big a deal. But on the other hand, aviation's got one unique facet, which is that the impacts are roughly double those of just CO2, because the altitude at which emissions occur give rise to some phenomena that roughly double the climate forcing relative to what you would get by burning the fuel at ground level. A second factor is that aviation is growing really strongly. And to the extent we expect the world to continue to develop economically, you'd expect aviation to double or triple its CO2 emissions by 2050 if things were on, the current trajectory. So you're going, let's call that, let's say we have 100 units of emission today. Aviation is 3, but we'll call that, let's say 6 because we double it. And that's going to double or triple, right? So we're getting up to 10, 15 units. And I think we'd all agree we want to see sort of 80, 90, 100% cuts by 2050. So you go from 100 units a day down to 20, 10, 0. And aviation has gone from 6 up to sort of 15, 20. So you can see there's this kind of crossover where all else being equal, aviation kind of takes up the entire atmospheric capacity for CO2 and other climate forces. So when you take that longer perspective, it really seems like an extremely tough challenge to face down.
Great. And last time I checked, no one's talking about, say, carbon capture on jets and trying to take that CO2 and store it somewhere else. So we've got to look at sort of different decarbonization pathways. But before we get there, I want to go through a tour de table of what those are. But give us a sense, how much of those emissions would be for personal travel versus how much would be for freight? Are we, as individual passengers, the baddies? Or is it the California lettuce that's flown into Calgary by air that I so like? Is that the baddie?
Well, personal and business travel really are the vast majority today. But freight is not negligible, and it's not an area that's been studied as extensively. But to give you a sort of illustration of the scale, the biggest single fleet in the US isn't American or Delta or United, it's FedEx, right? So, I mean, there are relatively few of these companies of that scale, but they are growing, and they're growing very fast.
Got you. Okay. Well, that's helpful. Now let's talk about the different decarbonization pathways. So you and I, Stephen, we had a pre-chat and we broke it out into 4 categories. So new propulsion systems like aerodynamics and tech, fuels and electrification, hydrogen there's a lot of buzz around it, operational approaches, and then economic measures. So let's start with that first one. What's going on with new propulsion systems? And I know you've done some direct research in that area yourself, which was sort of the topic of your last Quirks and Quarks appearance.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one. I guess new aircraft and propulsion technologies are kind of classically what you imagine aeronautical engineers work on, right? They design, more pointy-looking planes and more efficient planes and faster planes and things like that. And obviously, for the long-term future, that's critically important. And I think when you look out towards well into the second part of the century, that's going to be the most impactful thing in the long run. But on a timescale of 2030 or even 2050, it probably isn't hugely important. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that designing a plane, bringing it into service and manufacturing it, and it propagating through the fleet, that's something like a 40-year timescale, say up to 10 years to bring a new plane in, then about 30 years to propagate through the fleet. So that takes us, well past any of these timeframes we're really most worried about. The second thing is that even if you could design a magic plane today, no one's going to throw away $2 trillion of assets that are airborne as we speak, right? They're just extremely valuable to the world. And even if we had the money to throw them away and replace them, we couldn't, because aircraft manufacturing is totally maxed out and the back orders are there for many, many years. So if you want to buy a A320 today, you're out of luck. You're on a 5 or 10 year waiting list. So there's no path that's realistic that really retires or replaces present day airplanes anything like fast enough to meet the climate challenges we face.
Got you. Okay, well, we're going to talk about that one later on when we all discuss what's the future of the industry and that kind of inertia that we see just from the production cycle. Let's talk about fuels and electrification. Tell us, I've heard about Wright Electric, Harbor Air here in Canada on the West Coast. It's now got an E-plane, it calls. And then there's this whole field of sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF.
Sure. And I think when we're thinking in the nearer term, so 2030, 2050 timeframes, SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, which used to be called biofuel, that's really where the biggest wins lay when it comes to CO2 emissions. And I mentioned CO2 is roughly half of the overall climate problem for aviation. So sort of to zeroth order, you solve CO2 from aviation, by changing the fuel, because the new technologies are going to be incredibly important for the second half of the century, but they're just too slow where we are now. When it comes to electrification, this is again one of those things where it's sort of a timescale. In the foreseeable future, there's no world we can see where large airliners are electric. There's just not a battery chemistry that's been demonstrated that has even the theoretical specific energy to fly a large commercial airliner. There can be sort of smaller niche applications, maybe air taxis or very short range flights, things of that nature, and that will be great, and that will put us on the trajectory for longer term changes. But that's really planting the seeds for longer term change. However, I think electrification does come in another sense, which is that, at least my perspective is that if you're going to fuel an airplane, let's assume we don't want nuclear reactors on planes. So that's sort of putting that aside. People tried that once. So what can you fuel it with? Well, fundamentally, the energy will come from some fossil source. So that's one option. Or it will come from a biomass source. So that's another option. Or it'll come from some kind of clean grid, you'd hope, from electricity, via electricity, you could say. So let's say we rule out fossil. So that leaves burning biomass that's been converted into fuel, or creating fuel from clean electricity, or some combination. And the biomass is where the industry is going in the near term, and that makes sense. It's the cheapest way to make fuel that is sort of at least a lower carbon. But at least the studies I've been involved in say there won't be enough biomass in the world to fuel all of aviation realistically. Maybe it's a quarter or a half. It depends on the assumptions. But essentially, we ruled out fossil for the future. There won't, in the long term, be enough biomass. So all you're really left with is relying on the grid and using electricity by whatever mechanism to create to put into some energy carrier for aircraft. So in a sense, Elon Musk was right that the future of aviation is electric, just because there's no alternative, but probably not in the sense of having batteries on the planes, in the sense of having some kind of electro fuel on the plane. And that's sort of really the inevitable conclusion you draw when you look at the scale of the challenge we face. And I think that raises real questions for the rest of the energy sector is how we meet that challenge.
So we're not going to switch jet fuel to direct electricity and have battery stacks on planes. We're not going to have nuclear reactors, like I said, CCS. But then talk about hydrogen. So that's what you're talking about, is using electricity to produce hydrogen. Not
necessarily. I mean, I'm saying I think inevitably we have to use electricity to create a fuel. And then, if you have clean electricity, you can make many kinds of fuel from it. You might do direct air capture to get carbon from the atmosphere, and in a sense use the carbon as the carrier to hang some hydrogen off, and then you create a synthetic fuel that's pretty much the same as you have today. That looks pretty attractive in many ways. It's proven to be safe. Aviation is profoundly safe now. We're not going to want to back off on safety. It's got a lot of technological advantages. You could make it carbon neutral with clean electricity, but you could say, well, why don't we try other fuels? And one of the other fuels, as you mentioned, is hydrogen. And in some sense, it's not really an either or, because if you want to make synthetic fuels at large scale, you're going to create hydrogen at massive scale in any event. So, all futures for aviation require vast amounts of hydrogen. Whether it's biofuels, you need loads of hydrogen to put into the processing of that. Whether it's synthetic electrofuels that look like today's fuels but are made from electricity, you need loads of hydrogen to put into that. Or maybe you say, well, just burn the hydrogen on its own. And that has some pros and cons. One of the big pros is that it costs less energy to make the hydrogen per megajoule of hydrogen in the plane than it costs to make the synthetic fuel. Maybe it's a third less, depends on estimates. So you might say, well, let's spend less energy and make the hydrogen. On the other hand, the plane probably burns about 20% more energy when it's a hydrogen plane, because the fuel is volumetrically bigger and makes the plane draggier, the tanks are heavier and things like that. So in some sense, it's just a sort of economic balance as to which one is more effective overall. It's not fundamentally that different. It's, both could be carbon neutral, and both do rely on electricity in my view.
Gotcha. Okay, well, let's go through these last two categories and bring David and Sara into the conversation. So the third one is operational approaches. And, I remember I took a smarter driver course. I drove from Alberta Medicine Hat to Calgary with a smarter driver instructor next to me, and just a regular internal combustion engine car. and decreased my fuel consumption by about 30%. Is there an equivalent for aviation?
Yes and no. I mean, aviation is very different to road transport in that, if we were all rational human beings, which thankfully we're not, or life would be very boring, I guess, we wouldn't be driving around, nice cars and things like that. We'd all have very small, very efficient cars with no acceleration margin, right? And that would sort of at least halve the fuel consumption in the sector, probably more. But that's just not who we are. That's not realistic. But in the case of air travel, the planes are pretty well optimized. I mean, there's very little left you can possibly do. The whole industry has been strongly aligned with mitigating fuel burn for decades and decades. You might have a few percentage points left of fairly marginal things like routing slightly more efficiently, things like that, but it's a very small opportunity pool. Still worth tackling and still important to do because it's free gain in a sense when it comes to climate. But there is another way to look at that, which is that I mentioned only half of warming from aviation was from CO2. Almost all of the other half is from what are called contrails or condensation trails. And these are kind of thin, kind of line-shaped clouds you sometimes see in the sky behind airplanes. They serve to trap some of the outgoing radiation from the Earth and roughly double the warming from aviation. Now, it looks pretty likely it's possible to fly in a way that avoids creating those, and that would provide a path for significantly reducing aviation's climate impact.
Got you. Now, just quickly, they act as like a jacket. I've heard the analogy, but they also act like a shade. Contrails also reflect heat back. They reflect sunlight back up into the atmosphere. But Sara, you're saying on a net basis, it is very much a liability.
Yeah, on a net basis, it is. And it has some of the sort of physics is a bit like one of David's areas of academic study, where if you put particles in the atmosphere, it will sort of flatten the temperature profile, and it has lots of effects like that. But really, the first order effect we care about is just that it's a significant warmer for the industry, for the size of the industry.
Got you. Okay, and then very quickly, this last one, economic measures. We talked about offsets. I can go on, and there are all sorts of flight calculators that allow me to offset the emissions from my flight. I went on one for giggles the other day, and it said for however many bucks it was that I would burn 0.76 of a metric ton taking a flight from Calgary to Toronto. We don't want to slice and dice all offsets, but it just quickly, is that still an aviation decarbonization pathway? Does that offer any kind of promise?
I suppose in my view, I think offsets are part of the journey, but they're not really the destination. I mean, ultimately we need to get to zero, right? And when you're at zero, there isn't a whole lot of room for buying offsets by investing in other carbon reduction schemes and whatever else it might be. So I think it's all fine and useful to do in the near term. And you have, some airlines are really pushing the boundaries, like Delta, for example, is a carbon neutral airline. And okay, you could have arguments about how, what percentage of the offsets are really there or not. But I mean, it's still going to be a very big saving that's made a difference. And I think it's good to do, but I don't think we should rely on that as the solution as we approach 2050.
Great. Okay, let's go to David and Sara. But first, the poll, 48% of you think that emissions from aviation will be higher than they were in 2019. Only 12% of you think they'll be lower than they were in 2019, and 40% think largely unchanged. All right, David, Sara, given what you've heard, what changes realistically do you think we can expect the industry to make between now and 2030, given that most of our audience here, they're not terribly optimistic about the progress that we'll make in that time frame?
So I agree, obviously in the short term, that I think the capital turnover is a big challenge. I think one of the biggest things that we're seeing in the short term is some of the behavioral changes that are coming both from individuals around flying choices, but also around just alternative ways of, getting from point A to point B. And some of those are really coming about not just from, individual kind of desires, but actually because of government action, right? right? So you have France, for example, banning all flights that are less than 2.5 hours where they can be replaced by trains. And so I think that is, in places that you have to build a lot of new trains, that's of course more challenging. But in places where you can use existing rails and implement, overnight service, things like that provide you a different way of getting from point A to point B that from a consumer perspective isn't necessarily actually any worse, and in some cases can be more pleasant than flying. I think you have an opportunity there. But I would just point out on that I think that's a great example of sort of something that feels a little bit like a individual level decision, but actually has a lot of kind of government policy and systems change as its root. Because, as an individual, I can choose to take a train, but only if that train is available and if it actually goes where I need to go and it's comfortable and I can sleep on it and. So I think it's a good example where, it's going to be, again, I think, driven quite a bit by regulations, which are also, I would note, starting to come in more, at least on the international side too, right? So looking at the challenge of the use of carbon emissions from international flights is something that has been largely out of scope for the majority of carbon pricing systems that have been in place, and I think that's also starting to shift.
David, you want?
One comment is just sort of to go back to something that drive home something that Steve said, which is just how implausible it is that you're going to do batteries for long haul flights, and just maybe saying the numbers is useful. So long haul flights, and Steve can correct my numbers if I'm wrong, but are of order 40% fuel at takeoff by weight. They can be a little more, a little less. And current batteries have energy densities that are of order 30 times worse than fuel. And of course, there's some efficiency benefit for batteries, but when you put that together, it just seems really unbridgeable to me that you're going to do batteries. So kind of reinforcing the idea this really has to be about fuel choice or some combination of fuel choice and improving the efficiency of aircraft. I think behavioral change is going to help, but I think it's important to say how far we are from saturation for aircraft compared to other transport modes. So for lots of us in the developed world, if you gave us free car travel, we wouldn't travel much more. But for many people, if you gave them free air travel, they travel more. If you look globally, it's clear, and there's some beautiful Boeing figures that show this. Obviously, Boeing's trying to sell their service, but it's clear there's an enormous number of people who would like to travel by plane much more than they do. So the kind of inherent demand is there. And I think we should be cautious about generalizing from other relatively well-off rich country people about how much shifts in habits are going to change the underlying driver of demand. And the final comment is just how extraordinarily efficient aircraft are. Aircraft now have something like 1 megajoule per passenger kilometer, which is as good as walking, better than lots of driving modes. And depending on the rail system, it's significantly worse than rail, but the gap depends on rail. So it's sort of stunning how good conventional aviation is. And it's likely to get better because there are ways to get another. You tell me, Steve, but I think if you imagine some of these very high efficiency designs, there's maybe another factor of 2 out there over the next 3/4 of a century.
Yeah, I think a factor of 2 is a pretty good estimate. The thing about the factor of 2 is that it's in the 2050s, 2060s, 2070s, and we need that factor of 2. But we need to move out on the operational and fuel-based measures between now and then, I think.
Yeah, and so Stephen, I mean, you made a compelling case for why we're not going to get to new propulsion systems, really new mode of aircraft. As you said, no one's going to throw away $2 trillion of assets. And I didn't realize that, like so many things with supply chains these days, you want a new plane. Well, it's hurry up and wait for 5 to 10 years. But when I think of the opportunity, like 20 to 30% of an airline's operational expenditure, OPEX, is fuel. So if you attach a higher carbon price to that fuel, and then you do things, so yeah, there's not much governments can do to increase the supply of biomass, for example. So that's the limitation. But then there are things that they can do to make hydrogen easier to produce. And there's lots of this. Governments in Canada or provincially here in Alberta are trying to do that. So do you see the acceleration of hydrogen as a fuel carrier for aviation? Could it sort of fit within that 2021, 2030 timescale, or is it still going to take a long time to ramp up?
I think my view would be that it's probably not going to make a significant difference on a 2050 timescale. I mean, even if hydrogen production was scaled up to the extent it'd be the primary fuel, even if major manufacturers decided tomorrow to start a design program to create a plane that would fly in the early 2040s, or let's say 2030s, to be optimistic, then you have to start introducing it into the fleet gradually. There'll be one type of plane, maybe it's a narrow body. Gradually, it starts displacing the Airbus A320s and the 737. It's going to be a slow process, and there's also aviation's not a constrained business, right? If you take something like trucking, you could potentially have regionalized solutions for decarbonizing trucking. Maybe it's an ammonia fuel in some place, and it's LNG somewhere else, and it's whatever battery somewhere else. But whatever they are, you could at least regionalize it to some extent. Regionalizing aviation is possible, but hard. So, maybe if you had hydrogen infrastructure for refueling over all the main US airports, then you could have flights within the continental US that are hydrogen based. Maybe you could do that for Europe, but it's still not a great proposition for airlines that like to be able to use their planes everywhere, or for leasing companies that want to be able to lease out the airplanes to loads of companies, loads of airlines. And we know the industry really values flexibility, because the average flight you take is on an airplane that's way over spec'd for the mission it's flying. So the average flight is something like 1,000 kilometers or a bit more than that. But the planes can fly, order of magnitude more than that often. So really the airplanes can do much more in terms of mission than they're being asked of. And the reason is because these things are so hard to come by that you want them to be flexible to perform all kinds of different missions that might be asked of them.
I think about the hydrogen trade-off this way, that the hard part is getting carbon neutral hydrogen in huge quantities. But once you've got that, if you have hydrogen and you've got CO2, going to fuels, by synthetic fuels, by Fischer-Tropsch or some other route, that has a efficiency, energy efficiency that's over 70, can be around 80. And the capital cost is not that gigantic. And yet the benefit of those fuels of being compatible with existing infrastructure and higher energy density is really big. So it seems to me that once you've got cheap carbon neutral hydrogen, while there is a fundamental energy density benefit to hydrogen, which is much more important for aviation than anything else, it may be that going to some kind of hydrocarbon will keep winning for a long time because of compatibility and storage.
And even just in terms of, if you were to design the best fuel for an aircraft, you probably would end up with something pretty similar to a Jet A fuel today. I mean, it's pretty good. We've sort of been through the periodic table and can't really come up with something a whole lot better as luck would have it. I mean, ammonia is too low in energy density or a specific energy. Hydrogen's volumetrically too low in terms of it becomes too large. Storing hydrogen is terrible. Tanks are heavy. The planes get heavier. Technically, Jet A is a pretty good fuel. You just don't want it from fossil sources. Yeah.
So I must admit, coming in, I knew very little about aviation decarbonization. I'm learning a lot. One of the things I'm learning is that those wedges that I think could make a real difference are going to take decades to deploy. That the sort of the fuel base or the electrification based wedges that would make a much smaller degree of difference. They're the ones that you could possibly deploy on a shorter time frame, but again, it makes a little difference. So then, as a government, what are you to do? Because aviation is this growing share of global emissions. Every government worth its salt has not just a 2030 target, it's got a 2050 target. And yet you got this very complex industry where you have governments and customers seemingly on one side, customers want to do the right things, but then you have the airlines themselves, and then the plane and component manufacturers on the other side, and they're really resistant to any kind of disruption. So you're a good bureaucrat. What's the role? What can you do to try to get this industry to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of will out there to make change, especially within industry. In the past 2 years, there's been a sea change in the appetite to approach change and approach it quickly. So I don't think, unlike a few years ago, willingness within the manufacturers or the airlines is actually that much of a problem. The problem is sort of converging on what the solutions are, which also needs leadership from government, and having some kind of level playing field, because you do have significant environmental measures being taken by some airlines, but they're not going to put in, many billions. I mean, one airline's put in something like $1 billion, but not going to be many billions unless they know that all the competitors are going to have to do the same thing. So there does have to be a level playing field, and you could do that by a carbon price or by a more of a patchwork of regulations or different approaches. But essentially, we need SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, scaled up very quickly. We need to start creating e-fuel, electrofuel, or power to liquid plants. In other words, using electricity plus probably direct air capture to create carbon neutral fuels as quickly as possible. That would need stimulus from the government and whatever policy framework makes sense in the region. And those, I think, are the two things that could be scaled up over the coming decades and make a real difference. At the same time, continuing to provide investments in the fundamental aeronautical R&D makes sense, but that's been happening for many years anyway. So in a sense, that's just continuing down that track.
Yeah. And to be clear, thanks, Stephen, that's helpful. It's not like governments are sitting back and not doing anything. So in this country, we have a government that's got a carbon price that will go up to $170 per ton by 2030. And it's got programs, incentives, Sky's the Limit program that is a Government of Canada program that is really trying to create that incentive to create low carbon fuels. Sara, I mean, are you optimistic or pessimistic about where we're going? Are you one of those ones who think that aviation emissions will be higher than 2030, or can we bend the curve?
I mean, 2030 is short for sure. I think, one thing is to see actually what's going to happen, coming out of the pandemic, of like where actually airline travel goes back to and how that recovery goes. And as it drags out longer and longer, I think that can look different and different. I think, in addition to what Steve's laid out about the kind of different timelines and what we can do on the shorter term with the synthetic fuels while developing those planes, for the longer term, I think the other way that I would cut that is around, the short, medium, and long haul distances, where I think also, the solutions are very different there. But I do also, I come back again to this point of like really looking at, can we, when we don't have those technologies to completely decarbonize air travel, when do we need to have a more serious discussion about how much we're flying? And I realize the irony of me saying this as someone who I don't fly a lot now. I have all my family lives outside of Canada, so I'll fly to see them. But other than that, not a lot. I used to fly quite a lot for my job, so I was one of the baddies. But I think there's some real equity concerns here when you look at the people that are listening to this podcast and the four of us sitting around here are actually part of a relatively small group, right? Depending on where you look. So I couldn't find the Canadian data, but in the US, it's 12% of people that are responsible for 2/3 of flights that happen. And so, I think we sometimes look at this and with a little bit of a blind eye towards, how much flying a lot is part of everybody's life, and how much we can think about not, making deep self-sacrifices, because I think there's only certain numbers of people that are willing to, get on a boat to go visit family overseas. But really looking at, where are we flying and how much of that is replaceable? Because you look at the global growth in flights and the idea that in 2019, the stat I found at least was about 5% increase in passenger kilometers traveled. And that's much higher than, the GDP growth globally in that year, which was around 2%. And it actually looks even worse for places like, Europe, which had about a 6.6% increase in passenger kilometers traveled versus, a 2% increase in GDP. So I do think that we need to start having some of those hard conversations, not in the flight shaming and, nobody should ever get on an airline. And, I would be the first person to say, I'm not going to get on a boat to go visit my in-laws in Europe, right? That's not the world that I live in. But I think there's a big world between saying, I'm never, ever going to fly again, and I'm going to, hop on a plane to a desert vacation or a beach vacation just because I can. And part of that, I think, is then coming back to, whether it's carbon pricing or other ways, are we really actually reflecting the full cost of air travel in the falling prices, ticket prices that have encouraged a lot of this travel to happen? So I think that there is, I think, as people know, I'm also somewhat, I guess, of a techno optimist. And I do think that obviously we do need to work on those technology solutions. And I do think that we can get there as well. But I think especially in the interim, we do need to take a hard look at, just how much moving about the world we're doing and ask if that's really compatible with, with the situation that we're in.
And don't you think we could do with a little bit of flight shaming? Like you said, we shouldn't, but what's wrong with the Swedish approach? They're full on flight shaming. And I've got European friends and prominent ones who now feel that they're compelled to make public commitments that they'll stop flying.
Yeah, I mean, there is some interesting also research. I'll have to look up the paper itself, but this concept of, there's something that's the opposite of that, where you have, the very upper end of wealth in a society sort of starts to drive these increasingly consumptive behaviors. And so the idea of, constantly flying around for vacations and things like that, I think is something that we need to look at and ask, does that make sense? This is not all a ploy to get out of making flights to go see my in-laws in Europe, just to be clear. But I do think that there is, this question of what changes can we make, again, without asking people to make what they feel like are really deep sacrifices. And I think that is a conversation that needs to happen more.
Yeah. And I guess a question that I have is, to what degree are we going to see business travel bounce back? So here's the pre-COVID situation. I did a little straw poll in the hockey dressing room yesterday, and there's a guy who is a former energy industry executive. And I said, how many hours a month do you think you're spending on flights? And he was saying sometimes 80. Like, think of that, 80 hours. Like, a general work month is 160 hours, right? The average are 171, fully half that time as a high flying executive literally spent on flights. But now when you talk to people post-COVID, and given how familiar and comfortable we are with video and telecommunications technologies along the lines of what we're using today through this Zoom-based webinar, people are saying, I'm never going to go for one meeting for something. I'm going to sit there and, people would do that. They'd fly ridiculous different distances to have one meeting. And they're not going to do that anymore because we've had 18 to 20 months of good training in how we can have still good, seamless communication without doing that. And the technology is only getting better. Zoom technology during COVID has gotten better. Now we've got the metaverse that the good folks at Facebook are going to develop. So not only can we meet each other on Zoom, we're going to put in our VR goggles and meet and have a richer interaction. So I really wonder if we've knocked out a chunk of business travel that just from this long forced, this long period of forcing us to stay in our home offices and talk to each other remotely.
I think it might have effects that are hard to predict, in the sense that I'd say most of my academic collaborations were created over Zoom, and most of those led to in-person meetings later, because as well as learning the benefits of Zoom and Teams and all these other things, we've also very much learned the limitations, right? We know what we can achieve in these formats, and we also know that we need to meet sometimes. And I guess for myself, I would take a similar approach to what you mentioned, Ed, that I can't see myself going for day trips to DC for a 1 hour meeting anymore. I mean, I think that's clearly not necessary. But for serious work and serious conversations where you want to creatively develop ideas with teams and build relationships, I think we know that Zoom isn't really the format for that. So it's hard to know whether this will serve to create more connections in the future that could lead to more flights or less.
Stephen, you're not a techno optimist like you're not a techno optimist like Sara. You work at the great technology school of MIT. Can't you imagine having that same co-creativity through VR goggles and gloves?
Maybe sometime, but I guess I'm a techno optimist, and I think we will solve this, because I mean, I could see we could halve aviation's climate footprint within 5 years by doing contrail avoidance, which we didn't get onto in detail, but there's definitely a low cost, very doable way there to reduce by almost 50% aviation's climate footprint very quickly. So, that gets us halfway there. And then the other piece of it is that if we can solve the overall energy problem for the energy sector, then we can solve aviation. Because I outlined at least my view that aviation relies on clean electricity. So we need clean electricity. If we can do that, then we can solve aviation as well. So provided we're able to solve the rest of the climate challenge, which, I hope we all have optimism we can do, then it's kind of inevitable we can solve the aviation part, as long as we build the link between the two, which is the fuel production from electrofuels or whatever it might be.
I want to ask about the contrails thing, because we brought that in early, and we just ended up talking about the fuel burn. But 50%, that equivalent of 50% cut in 5 years is a giant thing. And I guess I really want to get a sense from you, Steve, of how plausible that is, what you think the barriers are, and what do you think it would mean if we do that? How does that, frankly, open up a kind of different view of climate where short-term forcers and radiative forcing are part of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very plausible. There've been a lot of computational studies that suggest you could eliminate almost all of the warming contrails for something like 1 or 2% of fuel burn penalty. And we're now in the final stages of preparing a trial with a major airline to demonstrate that. And there are also some new capabilities that the world has that we didn't have 10 years ago that make it much easier. One is machine learning, which means solving, in particular, identifying contrails is much easier than it used to be before. And the other is sort of high resolution geostationary satellites like NASA GOES west and east, where we can almost in real time see the contrails forming, use machine learning algorithms to identify them, and then put out advisories saying avoid this contrail forming part of the airspace. And so I think it's very doable. It's the cost is something like 1 or 2% of fuel burn, and the prize is something like 50% of warming. So I think it's really the fastest and cheapest way to make progress. And in the case of aviation, that's the thing you kind of start with, I think, as you ramp up the SAF and the e-fuels.
Wow. Oh, that's a huge, huge thing to say.
All right, let's get to the Q&A portion. We've got 15 minutes left today. So the first one, and Roman, apologies if I mispronounce your last name, Zombak. Stephen, can you talk about the best e-fuels candidates, especially from an onboard feasibility? And if you can, this is for bonus points, kind of list from least expensive up to most expensive or most challenging.
I think the highest priority one is what Romans called e-kerosene. In other words, a synthetic version of current day fuel, because that way it can go into the existing refueling infrastructure, the existing airplanes. It's already certified, well, at least something very close to it's already certified up to 50%. So it'd be easy to get through the safety checks. So you could make a difference very quickly by scaling that up. Going for something like ammonia has a lot of challenges. I mean, for example, ammonia slip would likely have detrimental effects on air pollution by increasing ammoniated sulfate compounds and ammonium nitrate in the atmosphere. So that would be a downside, and probably there'd be ammonia leakage associated with that. It's also not great in terms of the specific energy. So you'd have challenges of just flying far enough. It's not the nicest substance to handle, so there'd be safety challenges associated with it. So I can't really see any real benefits for aviation in going to ammonia. Other sectors that you could argue a different case, for example, shipping, you can make a case there that's a bit different. I mean, I think that then once you get outside those sort of ones, there's a infinite list of carriers you could invent, but having the team at MIT gone through the periodic table, it doesn't look like there's anything that has any particular significant benefit over hydrocarbon fuels that look like Jet A. I mean, in a sense, it's kind of obvious that we could have chosen one of many different kinds of hydrocarbon fuel, right? And people chose what we call kerosene or Jet A, and they chose that because it was good for this purpose.
All right, let's go to our second question. Thanks, Stephen. The old energy versus climate standby. Sorry, Robert, I shouldn't call you old. But our faithful listener and webinar participant, Robert Tremblay, has a question about other modes of transportation. So over to you, Robert.
Thanks. Yeah, so this sort of touches just on what Sara was saying earlier. But so stuff like France's ban on short-haul domestic flights, like if we're thinking about decarbonizing aviation, are these places where climate activists should be putting their attention on stuff like mode switching to rail?
I could give a perspective as well. Maybe Sara could expand on that, because I thought Sara made a lot of really amazing points. And I think for myself, I have a more I guess, technocratic view of the future, right? I think more people should be able to fly. I want everyone who's entering the middle class in China and everywhere else to be able to fly, to be able to experience education and employment and cultural opportunities around the world. And I think aviation has changed the world for the better to make it a place of more understanding, more education, more enlightenment, and more peace. And I think if we reduced aviation's accessibility, all of that would go backwards. So I want a future of more aviation, not less. So I think we need to come up with the technological solutions. The other thing I would say is that we discussed that, alternative fuels will be more expensive. They might be, let's say, 2, 3, 4 times more expensive. And that will pose an accessibility challenge, but the world is getting richer. And aviation has thrived in the past when the fuel has been much more expensive, more than double the price of today. So we know that the industry can thrive and grow at a much higher fuel price. And that's in part because elasticity for demand for aviation is pretty low. People will still fly even if the fuel price is double or more. So I think there is scope for higher cost fuels.
Yeah, maybe just 2 quick thoughts on that. I think on the first point, to me, one of the questions is a more equitable distribution of, aviation, right? And so this idea that there's a small portion of people that are doing the vast majority of the flying, I think is one place to look on that question of, flying more or less, and sort of what is the, what's a reasonable amount, I guess. I don't know exactly how to put that, but I think that to reduce demand, especially in kind of the shorter haul and domestic type situations where we're seeing a lot of growth, there is really this element of the role of government, and sort of, if you provide an option that's actually better and more comfortable, then it's not a sacrifice for somebody to, get on a night train and wake up somewhere new versus getting up at, 4 a.m, as I used to do, to go to the airport and have the, unpleasant experience of flying and getting through security and all of that. So I think that's a key piece of it. I actually wanted to come to a second question that Robert had also posed, but that I think is maybe worthwhile going through. Maybe I'll put it to David, but this question of how do you think of the carbon benefit, the CO2 math of using DAC to create a CO2 feedstock for e-fuels versus simply using DAC to, make the combustion net zero effectively? So sort of on the input side versus saying, well, we'll actually just sell a bunch of offsets and build these, big DAC farms like are emerging in Iceland, and that will be the solution.
And there's a beautiful phase diagram you can make if you plot the oil cost on one axis and the carbon cost on the other. That's in this carbon neutral transportation fuels paper I did a long time ago, and it's easy to show. There's a sort of phase diagram where at the very low oil cost place, then just DAC as offset works or whatever it is, and at the higher price you make synthetic fuels, and you can see that there's a trade-off point in the middle. I personally think the case for synthetic fuels is not just that. I think there's a bigger case, which is about the global distribution of the underlying energy that's making the fuels. And my view is the environmentally compatible way to make the fuels is going to be solar, and that's going to be in places that isn't evenly distributed. It's more in sunny places in the south, and that's where you're going to want to make the fuels. So I think that's part of the reason that I think going to fuels, whether it's hydrocarbons or other fuels potentially, is going to be so important.
A question I have that, David, you might know the answer to is one worry I have with the idea of burning fossil jet fuel and then using DAC to offset it is that are we then using up the global reservoirs of capacity to then sequester CO2 in the future? Assuming we'd like to, over the next few centuries, restore the planet by gradually removing CO2, and should we avoid using up those reservoirs, or is that sort of just not a concern?
No, I think so. First of all, I don't think DAC is by any means the only way to do large-scale removal, but I really don't think removal volume is the issue. The issue are social and environmental harms of large-scale removal, which I think some of them can be big. But if you just talk about pore space, I think if you're willing to move fluids around in reservoirs, I was part of the sort of consensus IPCC report on this, and the total volume is huge for CO2. That is many, certainly in the many thousands of gigatons CO2 equivalent, but that's even without some technological change. And if you count ocean alkalinity, then it's for ocean alkalinity, it's big enough that you actually, are dealing with the whole fossil reserve.
Yeah, just to weigh in on that one, I mean, Stephen, if you take the part of the country where Sara and I and David live here in Canada. You've got 46 gigatons of storage space here in Alberta. You've got 76 gigatons of space next door here in Saskatchewan. And then you've got, a few gigatons here and there in other parts of Canada. So you definitely have the space, you got the technical expertise, you got the trades to know how to turn the wrenches, you have the infrastructure, you have a sympathetic government, but there are other barriers. And at the top of the list is cost right now.
And simply energy required too, right? That's always a big thing when we think about how much energy it takes to do this.
Yeah, the energy isn't for the injection. The energy is
no, sorry, for the capture part. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I think I want to come back to the question, the really interesting questions about use. I do think that Sara, you're right that flying is one of the things where the wealthiest, I think, do have some duty to think about it. We can't all fly as much as we want, and some equity of access to flying. I think I agree with Steve. I think it's important to say, and I really don't feel that we should make flying a bad thing. I think part of the reason we're not having global wars is that people can talk to each other face to face. And I think the benefit of being able to do that really means something to me, but it shouldn't be all just the richest few percent. And it isn't, in fact. Flying is much more equitably distributed than wealth. And I think what you really have to think about is how much of this kind of emerging middle class, what their access to flying, what their desire is, and what a reasonable, equitable access is given the carbon constraint. But I agree. I think you're right to talk about the wealthiest.
Sure. And it's not a hard thing to imagine that we all fly a little less. I agree. Flight has brought me great benefits in my life, seeing family, new places. But certainly when I joined the Penman Institute years ago, and I did one of those personal GHG calculations, I thought I was doing well. I looked, given the Canadian household average on a per capita basis, I was well below it until I started layering back my business travel. And then that blew it away. And next thing I know, that 3/4 of my GHG footprint comprised of those flight-related emissions. Even though the calculators are highly fallible, to be clear, compared to the electricity I consume here in my house, or the natural gas I combust, or other sources of what I get from driving my car, the flight emissions are huge. So just by flying a little bit less, we can, help to sort of bend that down. But we're running out of time here. So let's end on an optimistic note. Peter Falloon has asked a question about momentum. So where does momentum on CO2 reduction exist in the aviation industry? And I guess going back to you, Stephen, where are you seeing progress and where are you optimistic?
Can I ask just a slightly sharper version of that? Stephen, you talked about how slow it is to develop new aircraft. So maybe turn that around. Let's say that you were somehow czar and Airbus and Boeing were at your command. I mean, are there government policies that could speed up the development of new aircraft substantially? If so, what?
I think it's just a really tough industry. I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize just how incredible it is, right? I mean, the fact you can board a vehicle that transports you at 1,000 kilometers an hour through the night and puts you on a different continent. I mean, it's and doing so in a way that's about an order of magnitude safer, more than your trip to the airport. I mean, this is a phenomenal industry that's been incredibly optimized, and it sets such a high bar for itself in terms of safety that meeting that with major innovations is just a colossal challenge. And we've all seen when the industry makes significant missteps, and famous one a couple of years ago. We're not willing to cut them any slack, right? So we're not going to cut them any slack on making any errors at all, right? We demand total perfection when it comes to the safety of us and our families, and I think that's not going to suddenly make it possible to design 737 sized aircraft in 2 years, right? This is not the scale of the challenge that's faced, and these things also take. I think I'd have to check my numbers again, but we're talking many, many hundreds of human lifetimes to build each one, right? The investment in building them is absolutely colossal. So it's tough to think of some policy that unlock, a super cycle of infinitely green aircraft that are perfectly safe tomorrow. I mean, we have almost perfectly safe, but the infinitely green, we're really not there on.
So, Stephen, going back to that momentum question, where are you seeing traction, and what makes you optimistic?
Well, I think control avoidance is one where I think there's right now the snowball is sort of growing. And I think over the next year or two, I'm hoping we can really push that, because I think it always made sense in the past to focus on CO2 in the public debate because people needed to get that. It's the thing that matters most. But now everyone understands that, or everyone is going to understand that, I think, understands that. And now it makes sense to start looking at other things, in some sectors as methane, in aviation as contrails. And in the case of aviation, that's half the problem, and we can solve it probably within 5 years. So I think it really makes sense to push on that. And then I think scaling up sustainable aviation fuels and hopefully moving towards demonstrators for e-fuels are the areas where things are moving. And if you take those things together, SAF, e-fuels, and contrail avoidance, if the energy sector can solve the problem of a clean grid, which is a big if, then you have a solution for aviation.
Great. Good note to end on, and direction back to Robert Tremblay. What can we focus on as consumers? SAF, contrails, and e-fuels. That's where we can push. Thanks. So a big thanks to Stephen Barrett for joining us today. I learned a ton, and I would harbor a guess that everyone tuning in today did as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
A reminder that this episode is going to be available on energyversusclimate.com for reviewing, or as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever else you listen. When you go onto a thing like Apple Podcasts, rate us. That really helps us to get the word out. So let us know what you think. Our next episode is going to be in a couple years. Slip, yeah, a couple of weeks. It just feels like a year each week. And we're looking at doing a special topic about looking at careers in energy transition. We'll be sending something out shortly that gives you a little bit of direction about what we're looking for, and you can help. So give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Support us at energyversusclimate.com using our donate function. We're grateful for all support. Thanks to our very patient producer, Eva Wojnijescu. And thanks to Mika McFarlane, as always, for superb webinar support. Take care, everyone, and see you next time.